Lord Julian Marrow, Earl of Renfield, had buried his pride somewhere on the road outside London, along with his fine coat and his name, and discovered that the thing about being invisible is that everyone shows you exactly who they are. "Move along," said the footman at Lady Carlisle's grand entrance, not unkindly, simply the way one speaks to a dog underfoot. "This is no place for the likes of you." Julian, soaked through from an hour of standing in the cold drizzle outside the brightest ballroom in London, said nothing. He had learned, over the past 3 nights of this peculiar, self-inflicted experiment, that beggars who argued were beggars who got struck, and an earl playing at ruin still bled the same as any other man, foolish enough to test it. His valet had done an admirable job of the costuming. A coat too thin, boots resoled twice too many times, a hat that had seen better decades. But no amount of costume could make the cold feel less cold, and Julian had developed, over the past 72 hours, a new and thorough respect for the misery he had previously observed from the warm side of glass. Through the tall windows he could see them, the very women who had spent the season smiling at him with such practiced warmth, laughing now at something unseen. Jules catching candlelight, utterly unaware that the wretched figure shivering beyond the glass was the very prize they had all been so carefully, so expensively pursuing. He had not set out to discover anything quite so bitter. He had only wanted to know, after Lady Henrietta's letter arrived 3 weeks ago informing him, with admirable honesty, that she could not, after all, marry a man whose fortune had been so publicly rumored to be failing, whether a single woman in London might value him for something other than a number attached to his name. His fortune, as it happened, was entirely intact. His steward could confirm every figure to the penny, but the rumor had taken on a life no denial seemed capable of extinguishing, and Henrietta had made clear that a rumor believed by enough people was, for her purposes, functionally indistinguishable from the truth. Julian had spent the first week after her letter in the kind of cold fury that generates poor decisions, and the experiment had grown from that fury like an ill-considered plant from poisoned soil. He was beginning to wonder, standing in the rain on the 3rd night, whether the experiment had proven anything at all, beyond the unsurprising fact that London's finest did not stop for beggars, when the first carriage pulled away from the entrance ahead, and the crowd on the steps thinned. 2 ladies swept past him, skirts drawn aside as though his very presence might stain the silk. A third laughed outright, a high, bright sound that landed somewhere just beneath his ribs. A fourth looked through him with the practiced absence of a woman who had learned long ago that acknowledging the wrong sort of attention was its own variety of trouble. It was the 5th who stopped. She was not beautiful in the way her younger sister was beautiful. He would learn this distinction later, though he could see even now that she had been placed on the steps to wait, rather than invited to linger inside. She was perhaps 26, dressed well enough, but not extravagantly, with the sort of composed face that a ballroom passes over quickly because it offers nothing that shouts for attention. But she looked at him, really looked, the way no one had looked at him in 3 nights of careful ruin, and the looking was not pity, and was not calculation, and was not the performed sympathy of a woman deciding how the scene might reflect upon her. It was simply recognition, one cold person acknowledging another. Then, without a single word of explanation, she began unfastening the clasp of her own coat. "You're freezing," she said simply, as though that were reason enough for anything. "Take this." Julian opened his mouth to refuse, and found, for reasons he could not immediately name, that he had no idea how. "You needn't," he began, but she had already draped it across his shoulders, her bare arms pebbling instantly in the cold she had just given away. "I needn't do a great many things," she said, with a dry, unhurried quality that didn't match the trembling line of her shoulders. "And yet, here we both are." She studied him a moment with those composed, direct eyes. "You'll catch your death standing here. Is there nowhere you're expected?" "Nowhere that wants me tonight," Julian said, and found, to his own considerable surprise, that it was the truest thing he had said in 3 nights of careful lying. Something in her expression shifted, not pity exactly, but a kind of recognition, as though she understood that particular flavor of unwantedness rather better than her fine coat and her sister's invitation inside might suggest. She glanced up at the windows and then back at him, and there was a tiredness in the glance that struck him as strangely familiar for a woman standing outside one of the season's finest evenings. Before he could say another word, a voice called from the top of the steps, sharp with the particular irritation of someone who has been counting heads and found one missing. "Eleanor, the carriage is waiting. Cassandra says you are holding up the entire party, and I will not hear another word about it." "Coming?" she called back, with the patient readiness of a woman accustomed to being summoned mid-thought, and turned to go, then paused at the bottom step, as though some instinct had caught at her sleeve. She looked back at him once more, seriously, without performance. "Find somewhere warm," she said. "Tonight, if nowhere else." She was gone before he could thank her properly, swallowed into the gold light and noise of the entrance hall, leaving him standing in the rain, with a coat that smelled faintly of lavender water, and a single name he turned over and over on the long walk home to Renfield House, like a coin whose value he had not yet determined. Eleanor. He did not know her surname. He did not know which family had claimed her or which house she returned to, only that she had stopped when 4 others had not, and that she had given away warmth she clearly needed herself, and that the voice that had called her back inside had held the particular note of someone whose time was not entirely their own. By morning, Julian had decided he would not let it rest there. He told himself this was simple curiosity, intellectual interest in a data point that did not fit his working theory of the season's women. His valet, helping him back into clothes that fit a man of his actual rank, received this explanation with the carefully blank expression of a servant who has learned, over 14 years, not to comment on his employer's stranger conclusions. It took less than a day to learn what he needed. Miss Eleanor Marchmont, eldest daughter of Sir Reginald Marchmont, a baronet, whose estate in Hertfordshire had, by every account Julian's steward could gather, been quietly bleeding money for the better part of a decade. The younger daughter, Cassandra, was the season's acknowledged beauty, 19 years old, dark-haired, much courted, and much discussed, with the kind of face that stopped conversation mid-sentence. The elder daughter was discussed rather less, except by those unkind enough to call her plain within easy earshot, a word Julian found he disliked more each time he heard it repeated, with an irritation he did not immediately examine. What he did not yet know, could not have known from any steward's inquiry, was what Eleanor Marchmont had done after that carriage delivered her home. She had gone directly to the small writing desk in her room, changed out of the gown she could not afford to wear carelessly, lit the last inch of a candle she was rationing to the final stub, and worked for 2 hours with a needle and silk thread on a piece of embroidery she would deliver the following morning to a draper's shop on Bond Street. She would hand it through the rear entrance, as she always did, to a pleasant-faced woman named Mrs. Howell, who had agreed 18 months ago, with remarkable discretion and only a single raised eyebrow, to sell Eleanor's work under the shop's own name and remit her a portion of the price. The sum Eleanor would collect Friday was not large. It would not be enough to cover everything. It would cover enough, barely, to pay the interest her father owed on a debt he had not yet found the courage to mention to his wife, or to either of his daughters, though Eleanor had found the letter by accident 8 months ago, and had spent every week since working to ensure the family did not discover the truth in the worst possible way, through a visit from the magistrate, rather than through their own father's honest confession. Eleanor had been carrying this for 11 months. It had begun as desperation, the night she had done the household arithmetic 4 times in a row and arrived at the same unacceptable answer each time, and it had become, somewhere in the small hours of 100 candle-lit evenings, the only part of her life that felt entirely her own. She was genuinely skilled, had always been, her governess had said so, though governess praise being what it was, Eleanor had not known until Mrs. Howell confirmed it in commercial terms that the skill was worth anything beyond a drawing-room compliment. Her mother believed the family's modest continued solvency was simply Sir Reginald's luck at cards finally turning. Cassandra believed nothing at all about household finances, having never been encouraged to think past the next ball and the dress required for it. And Cassandra was not to blame for this. Eleanor had decided long ago. Her sister had been taught, deliberately and systematically, that she was too pretty and too valuable to be burdened with arithmetic, which was simply another way of saying she had been taught that she was not responsible for anything. Only Eleanor knew that her father's luck had not turned, that it had, if anything, worsened, and that the gentleman to whom he now owed the largest sum, a Mr. Josiah Pelham, who had in the past 2 years positioned himself as an indispensable resource among the struggling gentry families of 3 counties, had begun calling at the Marchmont house with a frequency that made her stomach knot each time his carriage appeared in the drive. Pelham was 51, sharp-featured, and unfailingly polite, in the specific way of men who have decided that politeness is the most efficient surface behind which to conduct unpleasant business. He invariably asked after Cassandra. He invariably noted how beautifully she played the pianoforte. He invariably looked at Sir Reginald with the patient, measuring expression of a man who knows exactly how long he can afford to wait. Eleanor disliked him with a precision that had sharpened over 8 months of observation into something very near dread, though she could not yet have named exactly what she feared he would eventually propose. She did not yet know that the cold stranger she had given her coat to 3 nights ago was in the process of learning her name, and that within a fortnight their lives would be entangled in ways she could not have begun to foresee. Julian arranged their next encounter with considerably more care than he had arranged anything in recent memory, because he understood, from the moment he learned Eleanor Marchmont's name and circumstances, that the situation required delicacy. He could not simply call at the Marchmont house, as the Earl of Renfield, and explain that he wished to return a coat lent to a man she had believed destitute. The explanation would require him to confess the disguise before he had any standing with her, before she had any reason to receive such a confession charitably. And something in him, some instinct he did not yet fully trust, said the confession needed to happen on its own terms, rather than be forced by a logistics problem about outerwear. He sent the coat back through a trusted footman with a brief note, not naming himself, only saying, "Returned with gratitude and the sincere hope that it finds you in better weather." He told himself the anonymity was temporary and would be resolved at their next meeting, which he intended to arrange through entirely legitimate social channels. He contrived the introduction 6 days later at Lady Pelborough's musical evening through a mutual acquaintance who made the connection without remarking on it, as mutual acquaintances at such evenings generally do. Julian positioned himself so that the introduction was natural. He was already in conversation nearby, he turned at the right moment, he bowed as one bows at such events, with precisely the right degree of attention and not a fraction more. She recognized him before he had finished saying good evening. He saw it happen, a very small arrest of motion, a stillness that moved from her hands to her shoulders, to something behind her eyes, all in the space of 2 seconds. It was his voice that had done it. He understood that immediately, because it was the one thing he had not thought to disguise, the one element of himself he had carried unchanged through 3 nights in the rain. Her eyes came up to his, and held there a beat too long for mere polite attention. "Have we met, my lord?" she asked. Her voice was carefully neutral, in a way that gave him, he realized with a start, the choice. She was offering him room to confess or room to deny, and whatever he chose, she would proceed accordingly. He chose wrong. "I believe we have not had the pleasure of a formal introduction," Julian said, and watched something close behind her expression. Not quite hurt, but the particular controlled withdrawal of a woman who has long practice at revising her opinions of people quickly and without visible dramatics. She did not expose him. She did not say, "You stood in the rain outside Lady Carlisle's ball and told me there was nowhere that wanted you, and now you are wearing 600 pounds of wool and claiming we have not met." She spoke to him for the remainder of the evening with exact, impeccable civility, giving him nothing beyond what courtesy required, and he left Lady Pelborough's townhouse understanding that he had not merely failed to advance his position, he had actively damaged it, and had done so by choosing the coward's path when a braver one had been offered to him directly. He did not sleep well. He called at the Marchmont house 4 days later, under the entirely legitimate pretense of returning a volume of agricultural correspondence that Sir Reginald had once lent his late father and that had been sitting unread in the Renfield library for 3 years. It was the kind of errand that required exactly one brief visit and gave a man perhaps 15 minutes of drawing-room conversation, if no one was particularly pressed for time. He found Eleanor alone in the front parlour. Her needlework was on the table beside her chair, ordinary in appearance, nothing that would draw the eye, and she set it aside the moment he entered, quickly, with the particular movement of someone accustomed to putting certain things out of sight when visitors arrived. "I imagine," she said, before he had finished the sentence about the book, "that you have come to tell me the truth about Lady Carlisle's steps. I have been wondering how long it would take you to decide whether to bother." Julian set the book on the nearest surface. "You knew at Lady Pelborough's." "I knew before I had finished shaking your hand. I told you I do not forget a voice easily." She looked at him steadily, with the kind of composure that is not coldness, but has learned to look like it for protection. "I gave you the opportunity to say so yourself, and you chose not to. I found that instructive. You were right to find it so. I chose badly, and I have known it since the moment I walked out of that room." He sat down, not because she had offered a seat, but because something in the way she was watching him said that a man who remained standing was a man preparing to deliver a practiced speech rather than an honest one. "The disguise was my own idea. I had received a letter from a lady I had expected to marry, explaining that the rumors of my failing fortune had decided her against the match, and I was angry enough and foolish enough to conclude that the appropriate response was to spend 3 nights in borrowed rags, discovering which women of London possessed genuine character and which did not. It was self-indulgent, and it was poorly reasoned, and the chief flaw in it was one I did not identify until I was already standing in the rain, that I had no right to apply a test to women who had no knowledge they were being tested." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside, a carriage passed on the street, and the sound of it faded, and the room was very still. "And what did your test discover?" she asked, without inflection. "That 4 women walked past a cold stranger without pausing, which is not a mark against them, because a woman alone on a step in the evening has every sensible reason not to stop for unknown men in poor clothing, and that one woman stopped and gave away the warmth she was standing in, which is either remarkable charity or the habit of a person who has so long managed other people's difficulties that she does it without thinking." Something shifted in Eleanor's face, not softening exactly, but a recalibration, as though she were revising a calculation she had begun with insufficient data. "The second," she said, "if you require the truth of it." "I suspected as much." Julian leaned forward slightly. "Miss Marchmont, I owe you an apology that I have been constructing and discarding for 4 days, because no version of it adequately accounts for the fact that my dishonesty was the instrument by which I discovered something I had no business discovering, about you through a third party, rather than from you directly." "The coat," she said. "The coat was a pretext I managed badly. But it is not the only thing." He held her gaze. "I know about Pelham. I know about the debt. I did not learn it through gossip. My steward encountered the name through routine estate inquiries, and I pursued it because something in our conversation here last week made me suspect that you were frightened of something considerably more serious than a borrowed coat or an unacknowledged voice." The composure cracked, not dramatically, but in the way composure cracks when a person has been alone with something too long and another person has finally named it precisely. Her hands, which had been still in her lap, pressed together briefly and then relaxed. "How much do you know?" she asked. £9,000, due in full within 30 days. Terms your father has not disclosed to your mother or your sister, and a moneylender who calls on your family with a frequency that has nothing to do with social affection." "He wants Cassandra," Eleanor said. It was not a question. She had known, or suspected, and saying it aloud to another person did not release the weight of it, but did, at least, make the weight real, in a way that could be addressed, rather than merely endured in solitude. My father has not told her. She thinks Pelham comes because he admires her playing. Your father does not know that I know any of this, Julian said carefully. And he does not yet know what I intend to do about it. I am telling you first, because this is your family's situation, and you have been managing it alone for a year, and it seems to me that the least I can do, which is not nearly enough, but is somewhere to begin, is consult you before I act. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window at an angle that caught the dust motes, and made the room look like a painting of itself, like something preserved rather than lived in. You said the rumors of your failing fortune were the reason the lady broke the engagement, she said slowly. You said you were angry. You spent 3 nights in the rain over it. She paused. A man whose fortune is genuinely ruined cannot purchase £9,000 of debt in a month. A man who could easily do so and has simply been the victim of a rumor would find the purchase a matter of no great difficulty. Correct on both points, Julian said. So the rumors were false. Your fortune is intact. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone assembling information they have been given in the wrong order. Then who started them, and why? Julian had been preparing himself for this question since the previous evening, when his solicitor had laid the complete picture in front of him. He told her everything: the clerk in Pelham's employ, the 3 drawing rooms, the chain of sources his solicitor had documented with the thoroughness of a man who understands that incomplete information is worse than no information. He told her about his father's public refusal 15 years ago, the terms called dishonest in front of half the clubs in London, and the long patience of a man who had spent a decade and a half arranging himself into a position from which he could repay that refusal with interest. He watched Eleanor's face as he spoke and saw, moving through it in sequence, surprise and then comprehension and then a cold, clear anger that was not theatrical but structural. The anger of a person who has spent a year working to protect her family and has just understood that the threat to them was manufactured and aimed at someone else entirely. He used my father, she said, when Julian had finished. My father's weakness was convenient to him. It gave him access to Cassandra, which gave him something to leverage, which allowed him to sit in our drawing room twice a week, looking patient and generous, while he was in fact collecting pieces of a revenge he has been planning since before I was born. That is my reading of it, Julian said. Though I would note that your father's weakness is also his own. Pelham found the debt. He did not create it. No, Eleanor agreed, with a flatness that had clearly been years in the making. My father created it quite on his own. She stood, moved to the window, looked out at the street below for a moment. What is it that you intend to do, my lord? Precisely. Purchase the debt from Pelham. He will not wish to sell, because the debt is worth more to him as leverage than as money. So I will need to make the financial terms sufficiently unattractive that refusing costs him more than accepting. My solicitor believes it is manageable. Julian paused. I also intend to speak to your father directly, not to shame him, to make him understand that the situation requires his honest accounting of it to his family, and that I am in a position to ensure the debt does not follow him any further, provided he gives me his word on one point. That he will stop, Eleanor said, without turning around. That he will stop. She was quiet for long enough that Julian wondered whether he had miscalculated, whether the weight of having a near stranger propose to intervene in the most private catastrophe of her family's life was too much, or too presumptuous, or simply too late. And what do you want in return for this? She asked finally, still looking at the street. Nothing contractual, nothing owed. He considered his words. I want the opportunity to call here without pretending the book was the reason. I want the chance to be honest with you about something that is not a test or an experiment or a scheme, because I seem to have used up every variety of those already, and none of them has produced anything I'm particularly proud of. What I want, if you will permit it, is simply to continue the conversation we should have been having from the first night, without the rain and without the disguise. Eleanor turned from the window. Whatever she had been working through while she stood there was not entirely resolved. He could see that. But there was something different in the way she was looking at him now. Something that had not been present at Lady Pelborough's, or even at the beginning of this conversation. The cautious, considered look of a woman who is deciding whether to trust something that has not yet fully earned it, and who knows the difference. "You may call," she said. "I make no further promises than that, and I will thank you to tell your solicitor to be discreet. He has not lasted 30 years in his profession by being otherwise," Julian said. He left the Marchmont house that afternoon with no promise beyond permission to return, which he understood perfectly well was as much as the situation deserved. His solicitor moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who has spent 3 decades handling the complicated affairs of complicated families, and within 4 days had acquired Sir Reginald's debt from Pelham's books, at terms that left Pelham significantly worse off than he had expected to be. The amount required was not inconsiderable, but Julian's fortune, intact, carefully managed, and widely misrepresented by Pelham's planted rumour, absorbed it without structural difficulty. Julian then called on Sir Reginald, an encounter he had prepared for carefully, and which still proved, in the event, considerably more emotionally demanding than anticipated. The man wept. He had the helpless, exhausted weeping of someone who has been maintaining a performance for so long that the moment someone sees through it, the entire scaffolding collapses at once. Julian waited it out, offered nothing sentimental, and then extracted the promise about cards with the same steadiness he would have applied to any business negotiation, reinforced by the practical fact that Julian now held every note and letter that could be used against Sir Reginald, which made the promise somewhat more durable than sentiment alone would have made it. Pelham was not finished. He appeared at Renfield House 3 days after the debt transfer, arriving without warning in the mid-afternoon, and was shown in only because Julian's butler, who was 63 and had formed strong opinions about most of the aristocracy, had a weakness for people who arrived with the particular confidence of those who expect to be received. Pelham settled into a chair he had not been offered, and regarded Julian with the cold, flat attention of a man who has just watched a decade and a half of patience evaporate in an afternoon. "You have bought yourself a considerable inconvenience, my lord," he said, and dressed it as philanthropy. "Marchmont's debt was worth more to you as leverage than you will ever recover in sentiment from the family." "I did not purchase it for leverage," Julian said, "though I understand the concept is central to your business model." "You will find this city less cooperative than you expect," Pelham continued, smoothly, as though Julian had not spoken. "I have been here considerably longer than you have been paying attention to it. The rumor of your failing fortune was not difficult to plant. It would not be difficult to refresh. It would be somewhat more difficult," Julian said, "once the signed statement of your clerk, the one who placed the original rumor in 3 separate drawing rooms during the 3rd week of March, has been entered into the appropriate legal record and distributed among the partners of every gentleman's club in London. I have the statement. I have it witnessed and copied. I have explained the situation to my solicitor, who has explained it to his 2 most trusted colleagues, so that should anything happen to complicate my personal ability to distribute it, the distribution proceeds without me." Julian looked at him without hostility and without warmth. "You spent 15 years waiting to punish my family for my father's honesty. I have spent 4 days making certain that project is concluded. I would strongly encourage you to find a more productive use for the next 15. Pelham sat very still for a moment in the manner of a man performing a rapid and unfavorable calculation. Then he stood, smoothed his coat, and left without another word. Julian did not deceive himself that the matter was entirely settled. Men like Pelham did not make clean exits. But the clerk's statement was real, the distribution mechanism was real, and Pelham was above all things a practical man who understood when the arithmetic of a situation had stopped working in his favor. The gossip about both their houses would take another month to exhaust itself, as London's gossip required time to find newer scandals to pursue, which it reliably did. Julian called at the Marchmont house again the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. and a Tuesday because he had found a paper on agricultural drainage improvement in Hertfordshire that he thought Sir Reginald might find useful, and which was, he freely admitted to himself, an extremely thin pretext that Eleanor would see through immediately and would not comment on because she was too composed to bother. He was right on both counts. He also called because he had, in the intervening weeks, been piecing together the fuller picture of what Eleanor had been doing for 11 months, partly from things she said, and more from things she did not say. And the fuller picture was leaving him with an admiration that had started at the bottom of the steps outside Lady Carlisle's ball, and had been growing, quietly and without his entirely intending it, ever since. The embroidery income, he had worked out the arithmetic himself one evening, even at the top of what a good draper's shop would pay for exceptional needlework, the amount Eleanor could have produced in the small hours of 100 evenings was enough to cover interest on a debt of several £100, not several thousand. She had not been solving the problem. She had been holding the problem at bay long enough to find a solution, buying her family time with the only resource she had unilateral control over, which was her own skill and her own hours. It was the most competent piece of crisis management he had seen anyone perform, and she had done it in complete isolation, for an entire year, without once allowing it to show on her face at any ball, or musical evening, or drawing room she was required to attend in the meantime. He asked her about it directly, one afternoon in the garden, where she had taken to walking when he called, and the weather permitted, which he had come to understand was because the garden was the only place in the Marchmont house where she was not required to behave as though everything were fine. "The embroidery," he said. "I have been doing the arithmetic." Eleanor did not pretend not to know what arithmetic he meant. And the amounts are insufficient to cover a debt of £9,000, even over 11 months of very dedicated work. "You knew this from the beginning." "I knew the interest," she said. "I could cover the interest." The principle required a different solution, which I had not yet found. She walked a few paces in silence. "I was aware that I was buying time rather than solving the problem. I was less clear on what I would do when the time ran out." "You would have found something," Julian said. "Possibly. Or the time would have run out, and my sister would have found herself engaged to Josiah Pelham before anyone had found the decency to explain to her why." She stopped walking. There was a clump of lavender at the edge of the path, and she looked at it with the focused attention of someone who is choosing to look at a plant rather than a person while she says something difficult. "I am very glad that did not happen. I find that I am also, somewhat against my inclination, grateful to you, my lord, despite the fact that the method by which you first entered my awareness was irregular, and the method by which you initially handled the recognition was worse." "Both of those things are fair," Julian said. "I have not stopped being embarrassed about the second one." "Good," Eleanor said. "You should be." But she was almost smiling when she said it, in the specific way she had, where the smile was visible in her eyes before her mouth fully committed to it. And Julian, who had been paying close attention to Eleanor Marchmont for several weeks now, recognized this as one of her better moods, and proceeded accordingly. "I have also been doing a different kind of arithmetic," he said. "Specifically, my mother has, over the past 14 months, developed a notable enthusiasm for a particular Bond Street draper's needlework. She has purchased, to my knowledge, 4 shawls and 2 table runners, and what she described as the finest embroidered handkerchiefs she had seen in 30 years of looking. I have been calculating the dates of those purchases against the timeline you have described, and I believe my household has contributed, unknowingly, somewhere in the region of £11 or £12 to the Marchmont interest payments." Eleanor turned to look at him. "I had no idea who was buying them," she said, carefully. "Nor did my mother have any idea who made them. She only knew they were exceptionally well done." He looked at her steadily. "They were, by the way. I looked at them rather more carefully after learning you had made them. The quality is not merely competent, it is genuinely remarkable." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He had noticed that she had very little practice receiving direct praise, not for want of merit, but for want of anyone who had been paying close enough attention to offer it. She received it now, with the slightly uncertain composure of a woman who has not yet decided whether to believe it. "I had a good governess," she said finally. "You had good governess, and an exceptional amount of discipline, and a year's worth of extremely high-pressure motivation," Julian said, "all of which you applied entirely in secret, without complaint, on behalf of a family that did not know you were doing it, and a father who had created the problem you were solving." "He is still my father," Eleanor said quietly. "I know. I am not condemning him. I am simply saying that what you did was worth saying clearly, and I appear to be the only person in a position to say it who actually knows what it is." Eleanor looked at the lavender again for a moment. Then she looked at him. "You are less absurd than you were," she said, "when we first discussed this properly. You have improved somewhat." "I have had an excellent subject to improve toward," Julian said. It was another 3 weeks before he asked her properly. And when he did, it was in that same garden, on a grey afternoon, that could not decide whether to rain, because some symmetry had apparently decided they belonged to grey afternoons and gardens together. He had not prepared a speech. He had, in point of fact, been mid-sentence about something entirely unrelated when he realized that he had been arriving at this moment for weeks and had simply been slow to identify the direction of travel. "Eleanor," he said, which made her look at him, because he had not called her that in the garden before. "I would like to marry you, not to resolve a situation, or discharge a debt, or satisfy a symmetry about coats and cold nights, though all 3 of those things are true, because you are the person I most want to continue talking to, and I have been unable to locate a flaw in that argument for 3 weeks of looking." Eleanor was quiet for long enough that the grey afternoon made up its mind and began, very lightly, to rain. "I shall need to think about it," she said. "How long?" She looked at the rain falling on the lavender. "Ask me again tomorrow," she said, "and I will have thought about it enough." He asked her the following afternoon, in the front parlour, and she said yes with the matter-of-fact composure of a woman who has made her decision and does not require the ceremony of uncertainty to prove she has considered it seriously. And then, in a small and quite unguarded moment that Julian suspected she had not planned, her composure did something it had never done in his presence before. It simply rested. The careful holding dissolved for a moment into something warmer and less defended, and Julian, who had been paying attention for weeks, recognized it and said nothing, and was very glad. The wedding took place that spring, quieter by the ton's standards than an Earl's wedding might have been, though no quieter event in years had drawn so many curious eyes. Half of London had spent the preceding months thoroughly entertained by the account of the Earl who had played Beggar and the baronet's plain daughter who hadn't known enough to be impressed by him, and had, once the full story had sufficiently circulated, begun to quietly revise their earlier characterization of Eleanor Marchmont, from plain to something they could not quite articulate, but which made them feel, in retrospect, that they had been missing something obvious. Cassandra, freed from a debt she had never known, threatened her, cried at the wedding with an uncomplicated happiness that Eleanor found simultaneously touching and faintly devastating. She married 2 years later, a clergyman from Shropshire who had an honest face and no interest whatsoever in her bank balance, which Eleanor considered the best possible outcome. Cassandra never learned the complete truth of what her sister had carried for that year and a half. Eleanor chose not to tell her, deciding that the knowledge would only produce guilt Cassandra could do nothing retroactive with. But she came, eventually, to suspect something of it, watching the particular way Julian looked at her sister across a room, not as though Eleanor were the only person present, but as though she were the most legible one, the one whose signals he had learned to read most precisely, and that precision was its own form of devotion. Sir Reginald kept his word about the cards. Eleanor monitored this for the rest of his life, with the careful, patient vigilance of a woman who has once paid too much for trusting a promise given in tears, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that he kept it, not joyfully, and not without difficulty, but with the genuine effort of a man who has run out of excuses, and discovered, late, that his elder daughter had spent a year covering for them. He thanked her for it once. directly, in the second year of her marriage. It was the only time either of them referred to it, and neither felt the need to again. As for the coat, Eleanor had not asked for it back, and the note that had accompanied its return had been unsigned. She had kept the note. Julian discovered this accidentally, 3 months into their marriage, finding it in the small wooden box on her writing desk, where she kept correspondence worth saving. He did not ask about it. He understood, without needing to, that some things are kept not because they require explanation, but because they mark the precise location where one thing ended and another began, and deserve to be noted. The coat itself hung in the dressing room at Renfield House, mended where the years eventually wore it thin. Eleanor had retrieved it from the box in the attic to which it had migrated after their wedding, had repaired it with the same small, precise stitches she brought to everything, and had put it back in a place where it could be seen. When their daughter, 12 years later, asked about it, Eleanor told her it was the coat she had given to a cold man on a rainy night because he needed it more than she did, which was true, and which was enough. She did not tell her that she had kept it, because some debts, she had concluded, were better honored than repaid, because the coat was not really about the cold or the rain, or even the man, but about the moment she had acted from instinct rather than calculation, and found, against all reasonable expectation, that the instinct had known exactly what it was doing. If this story warmed you the way Eleanor's coat warmed him, then stay close. There's another tale waiting, just like it. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you longest.